everyone. My name is Ian, and I'm going to be talking to you about this illustration of mine, Portage and Main Robot 002. To start with, the naming of it is due to a rather infamous corner here in Winnipeg, Portage Avenue and Main Street. Up until very recently, you were not able to cross it as a pedestrian. Recently, it was open to pedestrian traffic. And I took a series of photos in that area with the intent of doing a bunch of robot illustrations. Um, the illustration I'm starting with here, this is being done on my Samsung Galaxy Tab S10 FE. I recently switched over to it from the Tab 6 Lite. I much prefer this. This is a very, very nice machine. But I just wanted to do the rough sketch with it. Um, Now, originally I was showing myself an overhead camera of drawing on it, but the lighting wasn't great on that, so I've just switched over to using a video feed from the program that I was using, Ibis Paint X. I find this is actually a very, very good program for both drawing and painting. Mostly I end up using it for sketching. I've done some digital ink pieces with it. But lately, because I'm using this more powerful tablet, I've actually done a few. I've done at this point two fully rendered, full color digital illustrations with it. But right now, with this particular piece, the complexity of the background, the complexity of the whole piece, I knew I wanted to do the actual painting in Photoshop, but I still like doing my drawing work in with the tablet. It's a lot more portable, a lot easier to work with. Um, like I said, I had taken a series of photos of the corner of Portage and Main, and in this one, I've meshed it with a photo of a model that I took quite a few years ago, Erin, where originally she's actually standing in the woods in Birds Hill Park, north of the city, but composite her into the photo to be able to do this illustration from it. She's probably a little bit tall in the frame. It's hard to judge. She's actually quite tall, especially in the heels that she's wearing in this illustration. She's well over 6 feet tall. Um, but I wanted to go with the notion of one of my longstanding robot character designs, standing or walking across this particular corner in Winnipeg, give it a very strong local flavor. Um, Another difference between this and some of the robot pieces I've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years is both this and the first illustration I did from references taken from this corner. They're done as daytime shots, not using any extreme lighting effects. I'm not doing it as a nighttime shoot. I'm not turning it into a rainy setting. This is being done as though the character is standing on this corner during the day, bright sunny day, um, just wanting to play with different colors. I've been doing so many illustrations with a very strong synthwave look, either a red blue or a red and purple look to them. With these last couple of illustrations, I actually wanted to go for a bit more of a naturalistic look, but still playing with a lot of color theory, using color to separate planes and things like that. So it won't be 100% realistic, but it's going to be bit more naturalistic than some of my earlier pieces. Now, with this one, when I taken the photo, they're actually this is actually a composite of a few different photos, one of which had a crane driving past. So I ended up dropping that into the scene as well. So she's standing at Main Street, but in the background, the street that's crossing it would be Portage Avenue. And you can actually see there's one particular light stand back there that will say Portage Avenue in the final version. It's sketched in fairly roughly here. Um, Now, this illustration is basically being drawn 3 times. The initial sketch based on the photos. Um, then a tighter sketch, which would introduce the various robot elements, all the plating on the figure, the equipment that she's carrying, things like that, as well as getting deeper into the background. And then a final version where the robot plating design, as we've got finished up here, is much tighter, it's much more concrete, and I really nailed down what the background elements are. Now that I've poured over into Photoshop, um, the original sketch was done at about 12 inches by 18 inches at 300 DPI, which would be print ready, but I much prefer working at a higher resolution. So when I imported it into Photoshop, I upped the resolution to 600 for the actual painting. And this is a very standard method I use for when I do any sort of painting. It's also the same method I use when I do digital coloring from traditional inks, where I will put down large chunks of color on their own individual layers. Right now, her hair and each one of her boots are on. Those are three separate layers, so that I can color them later. I can do the modeling, the rendering. Um, they are isolated. They won't affect anything else around them. Um, and I'll do that, like I said, I'll do that for digital illustrations. I'll do that for when I'm coloring traditional line art, like for an upcoming book project that I'm currently at the inking stage of. Um, right now, I'm putting in, as you can see, there are a variety of different colors here. Each, we've got a green and we've got a blue. The blue is on its own layer, and all the green elements are on a separate layer. These purple elements are a separate layer again. Basically, every individual color you see here is on its own individual layer. And that layer, when I go to paint, will be locked, meaning if you paint over it, nothing outside that particular color selection will be painted on. It's very convenient. It can be very memory intensive, but machines these days are pretty good about that. So right now, the central character is all of the various color layers are prepped for painting. None of these colors will match what I'll actually be painting her. The same with now that I'm working on the post in the background, and as I create various color layers going further and further back into the distance, none of these colors will be reflecting what the actual painting colors are. I've mentioned this in other videos, that generally I create colors that I would find annoying, that is a reminder to remind myself that, oh, clearly I didn't color this particular section because now there's this horrible lime green staring out at me in a sea of purple and red, or something like that. Like, it'll be very, very different. It'll stand out. So as I'm working on the background crane right now, laying out additional color layers, when I did the initial drawing, I worked from front to back. I started with the main character and then developed the background as I went along, both in relation to her and from the original photo reference that I had taken. And now that I'm laying down these color layers for painting, I'm doing the same thing. Basically, everything I've worked on are the topmost layers. And as I move further into the background, those layers are themselves deeper in the background. But once all that's done, I'll then be painting from back to front. So I'll be starting with the sky and then working forward. Right here, I'm laying down a flat color for a particular building where I fill the entire building in with one color. And then I'm actually going to deselect where the windows are, so that the windows will be on their own separate layer, physically behind or below, in the way the Photoshop does it, the rest of the building. So you can see here that I had created one large selection for all of that vertical column of windows, and now I'm deselecting the spaces in between, and I'll be deselecting the rough frame. All this is based on the actual corner at Portage and Main here in Winnipeg. These are all based on real buildings. And here is the completed flatted illustration, where just the basic flat colors are down, have been laid down. Again, nothing here is what the final painting will be. But I've already started painting the deep background. So, as I was saying, this is a daytime scene, very unusual for me for these types of illustrations, where it went with a fairly pale blue, um, used the gradient tool to put in even much paler blue up from the bottom. And now, using one of my custom brushes, I'm painting in uh, basically clouds. Most of my painting work in Photoshop, I just use circular hard edge brushes. I'll do a little bit with airbrush style brushes, but for the most part, I just paint with a series of circular hard edge brushes, except for things like this, except for cloud patterns and certain texture patterns on ground. I created a few custom brushes for doing that, and I really like how that ends up looking. I might do some additional work with those hard edge brushes later, but right now, actually, most of this was done with a single brush design, and now I'm beginning to work on the deepest background building. Um, And typically, not only do I work from back to front, I also work from dark to light. It's basically just laid down a deep black for the entirety of that building layer, and now going in and hand painting the lighter. I basically even painting with light. Um, Now I do have my photo reference. I also still have the original illustration. The original illustration is in a channel. It's not on the layer. If you were to print this right now, it would just print as mostly blocks of color in the little bit of painting that's been done already. But if I turn on the visibility of the channel that has the line art, which you'll be seeing shortly, it will show my original illustration, which can help guide the actual painting. But unlike when I'm digitally coloring from traditional inks or from traditional pencils, the line art itself will not be appearing in this illustration. It's just there as a guide. It's just there as a reference to give me the basic setting, the basic composition. But all of the detail work, anything you would see in here, all lighting effects, everything is strictly done on their own separate painting layers. They will not be the original line art will not be interfering with that at all. So I'm painting this one relatively modern building in the background, sort of a modern steel and glass vertical ice cube tray, and painting. I'm not making the straight lines super straight. I do tend to prefer to make them just a bit more hand drawn, a little bit more wobbly, a little bit more naturalistic, giving it a slight bit of character. This can reflect a bunch of things. First off, it can reflect that there are very few straight lines in nature, but also it gives it an inherent sense of movement, a little bit of a dynamic quality, possibly also a heat haze coming off of the buildings in front of it. This is the middle of the day, and it will be under bright sunlight, so the images themselves will be slightly distorted by things like that, and that can all be implied by using much more of a freehand approach to the line art. Well, to laying down what would be straight lines, even on a relatively modern building like this. But yeah, you can see that I'm picking out the frames around the windows. On other buildings, I had separated the windows onto a separate layer. But for that particular building, because I knew in real life the windows are so darkly tinted, they're a very similar color to the metal around them. So I wanted to leave it all essentially as one layer, so it could easily be hand painted. And would have a similar texture to the whole thing. Conversely, the buildings here across the street, and you can see now you can see the line art that I was originally using. None of this line art will be in the final version. It's just there as a guide. But here we've got multiple colors going, and all the windows are cut out and are sitting on a layer behind that building. that will go a long way to separate the texture of the glass from the texture of these buildings. Whereas the first building I was working on, the texture of the glass and the texture of the metal building are very similar. They're both equally reflective. They both well, they reflect light in very similar ways, and they are distorted in very similar ways. Like any heat haze would affect them both the same way. Whereas this is all the building I'm painting right now is all brick and stone. Um, so I'm picking out individual bricks at the moment on the what would that be, the south facing side of this particular building. Um, but that will all reflect light differently than the glass in the windows will. So when it's going to be a different texture, I'll tend to keep it on a separate layer, depending. Um, the primary light source in the background, and this gets to where I was talking about color theory earlier. The primary light source in the background is actually going to be, it's basically a bluish light coming from the right hand of frame, from above and to the right of frame. Um, and there's a secondary light that's coming from uh, not above, but basically across and the left hand side of frame. And that'll be a warmer light. Now, in the deep background, it'll still mostly be shades of blue. Um, right now, there's a lot of other colors in here, but as I move forward in space, I'm actually going to be applying a few special effects layers to mute some of these background elements, to push them further and further back, but also casting a bit more of a blue glow on top of all of them. Um, Again, this just serves to push everything further back and to pull focus towards the main central character in this piece. So right now I'm playing with a lot of warmer tones, a lot of these browns and a little bit of yellow in there, interacting with the neutral and blue backgrounds. Um, but as we go along, I'll be adding in a little bit more yellow here and there. But then that's all being set up so that when I want to put in this bluish glow, it won't erase that. It's not going to. We're not going to get rid of these yellow tones or these warmer tones, but it will serve to minimize them a bit more, to make them less intense, less saturated than the main character. Oh, and here we're painting a Canadian flag because there's actually a Canadian flag on top of that building. So like a little bit more CanCon in this particular illustration. I don't do a lot of illustrations that are explicitly set in Winnipeg, but I have been kind of wanting to do that for a little while. I actually just finished up a pencil illustration of a model sitting at a rather prominent fountain behind the legislative building, also here in downtown Winnipeg. Um, there's nothing explicitly Canadian in that particular shot. It's just based off of a well-known Winnipeg feature. Um, Now, with painting the flag here, I'm also trying to make sure to give it a bit of a translucent feel, going for a much brighter red in places. I want to make sure, though, that you can see a little bit of the sky behind it. And now that we've zoomed out a bit, you can see the entirety of the two background layers, actually, the buildings and the windows. And now we're applying this blue filter, this blue glow, excuse me, over the entire background. There's still a lot of yellow. There's still a lot of warm tones visible in it, that deep background. Um, as I moved forward in space, and I zipped through a bit of this in the painting process, um, I would do another one or two buildings on a layer closer to the viewer, using the same painting ideas, and then put in an additional blue glow that would serve to push everything further back as it went along, so that nothing in the foreground would get overpowered by the warm tones in the background. But now that I have the bulk of that all done, now I've added an additional effects layer, basically a touch-up layer, to pick out, because you saw earlier the trees were looking a little too surreal, a little bit too undercooked, and then I added in a lot more detail onto the trees to make them pop a bit more. I still don't want to make them hyper detailed and hyper realistic, because anything like that for the illustration I'm doing would pull too much focus away from the main character. But I still want to give it the sense of it being a real place, of actual mass in the background, of the way the sunlight is interacting with the elements in the real world. And just like I was doing with the buildings, with these cars, I had separated them in two layers and painted the main part of the car and then the headlights and the windows behind that, and also the vehicles that were further behind that I kept in that separate layer. Now adding in these street elements, the literal street underneath all those vehicles. Now we're getting to the crane, which I'm going to put a bit more detail on because it's further forward in the frame. It's closer to the viewer. And as we get closer and closer, we'll be seeing more and more detail. And again, because I'm not restricting myself to the limited palettes that I did with a lot of my other red, blue, or red, purple illustrations. I want to pull in other colors from the environment. So there are a lot of trees in downtown Winnipeg. So I'm bringing in a lot of green. You can see some of the trees behind the building, behind the crane already. But I threw reflections of some of the green onto the windscreen. There will actually end up being green in the rest of the structure later and on the main figure. But right now, I want to put in more warm tones, more of a yellow, more of an orange color on one side of the crane. This crane the side that's aiming more towards the viewer, because that's roughly where this warmer light is coming from, which will be much more prominent on the main character. But I still want to have some elements of it being warmer. But not always. Light reflects off of a lot of different surfaces, so even in the parts of the crane that are facing towards the viewer, I'm still putting in some bluish reflections from the ground, from other parts of the environment, other elements of the environment, because these are all metallic surfaces. These are all fairly reflective surfaces. They're going to pick up a lot of those reflected colors. So I do want to make sure that I want to make sure all of these various elements, the cars, the buildings, the crane, and then the central robot, all look like they're inhabiting the same space. And a big way of doing that is by having the color of each item reflect, at least to a little bit, into each other. Now we're much further into detailing the crane, including these flashing lights on the top of it. You can see a lot more detail that I had built up on the structure of the crane itself, in the windscreen. When I'm working on any individual piece, I don't want to over render one part of it. I want to basically it's almost like painting the entire thing at the same time. Where I'll put in the basic colors for each side of it, and then go in and add a bit more detail on each side, so that I don't over render one half or one piece of it without remembering to make a different part of the same figure or the same element just as detailed, because then it'll stand out as looking a little bit weird. So here with this fire plug, I had done a very simple pass of very, very basic color patterns. But once I got that basic color pattern done on both sides of it, reflecting a cooler light in the background, a warmer light in the foreground, I then went over and started adding additional detail. So nothing would stand out as looking really different from anything else. As these elements get closer and closer to the viewer, they will have more detail. So, so all the foreground elements have more detail than the deep background does. So that this pole that she's standing against will actually have sharper contrast and a bit more detail than those poles way off in the background. But now the bulk of the illustration is completed. And now I can spend more time concentrating on the main figure. Um, all told, I probably spend as much time painting the main figure as I do the rest of the piece put together. But for me, it's very important to to paint that setting first because I may have made some lighting decisions um, in that deep background that'll end up wanting to reflect into the main character to increase that sense of her inhabiting the same space as the setting that she's in. So it's possible that initially, like right now, when I'm painting the her hair, I didn't have a concept of any sort of blue light on her at all. And if I had started with the main figure and then went to paint all the backgrounds and started doing, playing with more and more blue colors in the background, I'd realize that I would want to put that blue light on her from the direction of the background to reflect that this light is coming from behind her. So I would have to go back and fix that. Whereas here, as you can see already when I'm painting the boots, I have this yellow light, I have this warm light coming from the foreground, coming from roughly the direction of the viewer, but there is a blue reflection on the other side, the side of her that would be facing towards the background. This helps to ground her. This helps to ground her in place, keeping her in the illustration. She's not floating above it. Right now, she does look a little bit like she's floating above it because the depth of shadow underneath her doesn't match the intensity of the color of her boots just yet. But I will be touching up the ground to make that a little bit darker underneath her, so it actually does look like she's standing on the ground. Um, Now, when I'm working on the various metal plates on this robot figure, I do start from the front and then go back. Um, so right now, starting with the primary warm tones coming from the foreground and to the left of frame. And then as I go along, I'll be going further and further back into the character. But this is still the last thing I'm painting. Like this foreground figure as a totality is the last thing, the last element of this illustration that I'm painting, because as I was talking about, wanting to make sure that the background lighting effects reflect on her at least a little bit, so that she's part of her environment. Um, but this also helps me be able to focus and make sure that she is the primary um, focus of the illustration. This illustration is going to be about her. It isn't about this corner as much as this whole thing got started because of wanting to do illustrations set in this particular corner in Winnipeg. Ultimately, it's this character's interaction with this corner, with this particular setting, and that's what the vast majority of my illustrations are about. It's about the character and how they're interacting with the setting. It isn't necessarily just about the setting. Um, and already I'm starting to put in the blue light coming from that deep background. Uh, the blue light coming from behind her. It's still affecting her, not as much as it's affecting the buildings behind her, but it will still affect her because she's part of that environment, because she is part of this particular setting. Um, there could also be other things just off camera, just off panel that we can't see that are reflecting light back onto her. And that will be more prominent later when I start adding in some green tones. Um, also be adding in some red tones. Her hair is going to be reflecting into the metal of her body. So that's something I want to make sure to include in here, because then otherwise the hair just kind of looks like it's sitting on top of the figure, but it's not really part of it. And I want to make sure that because she is so reflective, I end up incorporating the red of her hair into the reflections of the metal components of her body. Um, because she is a robot with these various plate segments, not only do these sections of plate, not only do I have to follow the contours of the human form when I'm painting them, these individual plates also have their own individual contours. Like at the end of each plate, they're curved. So, like here on her leg, it curves along like the contours of the human body, but where it cuts to show a plate underneath it, that edge there is slightly curved, and that will reflect light differently than the rest of that particular shape. So I also want to make sure to catch that, so that I catch multiple reflections from multiple directions. And if those directions are pointed towards a different color of light, like if some of those plate segments end up pointing behind her, then it'll be picking up a rim of blue light as opposed to the warm tones coming from the other direction. Uh, so here I've already started working on the next section of plates underneath that first one. And I'll just keep progressing that way until I have all of the metal of the body completed. Mostly. There's always going to be a final pass after I've done all the various elements, just to make sure everything ties itself together. Um, and here we've got adding in, we're started adding in the red tones, the red reflections from her hair into the rest of her figure. You can see in particular up on the shoulder how it's picking up the red hair coming off the side of her head there. And as we go along, I'm just going to keep adding that, but I'm also adding in the blue light coming from behind, starting to think about what other lights coming from different directions am I going to be using, and what colors will I be using for that. When I first was discussing color, I was discussing color theory. And what I'm going with here is the traditional color theory that things that are further away from the viewer are cooler, meaning they're shifted more towards blue, and less saturated. That is, there's less color there. Things that are closer to the viewer are warmer, so shades of red and yellow, and are more saturated. They have more colors. The colors are richer the closer they come towards the viewer. Now, this isn't a universal concept. A universal concept. You can play with this, but it's an important one to know about when you're playing with color images and when you're playing with light, with how light is working. Um, Sometimes it's perfectly acceptable to completely flip that. But that's a great way to establish essentially distance in an illustration. The fact that the background is cooler and lighter than the foreground is. She will really stand out because she's essentially being framed by a cool blue light while she is being hit with a strong warm light that's very close to her. So the actual tone, the actual color of the figure is like a bronzish gold character. But even if it was completely neutral, even if it was like a steel gray, she would still be picking up a lot of yellow tones. If I decided that she was steel gray, then she wouldn't have as many, quite as much of this rich, warm color all over her, but she would still have a fair amount of it coming from the foreground and to the left of frame. But with her, I wanted to go for a little bit more of a warm tone overall. Now that I've done the first pass on the painting of the figure, now we're getting into the various belts she's carrying, the various equipment she's carrying, going for a very cyberpunk / cassette punk, I guess is the term being used these days, look to a lot of this equipment. So she's holding a computer pad in one hand. She has another computer device in the holster on her hip. There's another one below that. There is a screwdriver in a holster of sorts on her arm. And when I first started painting this, I was still going with the warm tones. But you'll notice that I've used a few purples in some of the buttons, and I realized very quickly I liked those purples, so I ended up changing my concept of the overall belts, the color of the belts that she was using, so that it's primarily purple, and then the warm tones will change the colors a little bit. But the base color for all of these belts is purple. And that just added a nice punch. It separated it from the post behind her. It separated from how warm the color of the the leather boots are. Um, it's not a huge change, but it's nice. I didn't want to drown this illustration in too many colors, so it makes it much more effective when I've added in some of these green tones coming from the right of frame. That having that being consistent, there's this green element all over the body, showing that yeah, there's something green just off the panel, something beside the viewer. Um, but if I had too many different colors in her belts, it might distract from that. And I wanted to keep the color scheme of this, while more complicated than in my red blue or red purple illustrations, I still wanted to keep it relatively simple, um, but simple but realistic. So her color scheme would be fairly simple. The background would be a lot more varied, but then would be blanketed in this softer blue glow that would mute everything. Um, and now that I've painted the main figure, now we're going in and punching things up a bit, adding in individual strands of hair coming off the figure, playing with the lighting a bit more. Now bringing in that green light, it's reflecting off her into her hair as well. So I also ended up pulling back on the hair a little bit, and now we get into, here we go, more of a glowing effect on top of her. Because she's metallic, she is actually, in order to get across the notion of being very reflective, I'm painting using a screen, which is creating this vibrant color bouncing off of her, this much more vibrant red and orange. So adding to that warm color coming from the foreground and reflecting off of her. But yeah, we're heavily into the final stage of this illustration here. So again, this portion all being done in Photoshop, 12 inches by 18 inches, 600 DPI, and yeah, just the final bits of adding in a slight blue glow on the side that's facing away from the viewer, that's facing towards the back and to the right of frame. Just adding to that sense of three-dimensionality, creating the sense that she is um, inhabiting this space, that that she isn't just some abstract shape on top of a city scene. Um, and then punching in a few more tighter details, a bit more brighter highlights here and there, to even add to the reflection a bit more. And then I believe we're getting very close to the end of the illustration, and here is the completed version. Thank you very much for hanging out and listening to me discuss working on this particular piece, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.